into a forest right now, if any of us had to go out into a forest and reconstruct a plant just based upon all the stuff that was on the forest floor, you imagine that many of us would be putting oak twigs with maple leaves and all these other kind of weird combinations. So we really need to make sure that we have the evidence and as good of fossilization as we can get to try to put these all together. Now, the interesting thing about this talk and this approach is that a lot of times we don't think about the ecological view of this, right? We're so busy trying to get evidence and reconstructing things in the organismal level, which is challenging unto itself. Let me not underestimate that there. But then at some point we need to start to understand the ecology. And that field is actually referred to as paleoecology. And it's challenging unto itself. It's trying to take all the information of people know about the organisms and then how they interacted with one another. And then you got to bring in the geologists and the people who study chemistry and all those other different aspects. So understanding all these pieces are a real challenge for anybody. And luckily, a lot of people who study ancient systems and ancient organisms now are working together to take the specialties of all these people to try to reconstruct what the Earth looked like a long, long time ago. But what that means for you, besides my enthusiasm, but what it requires from you as the audience is it's going to require learning some new information, some new terms, because as I just mentioned, paleontology as a whole, whether we're looking at it from an organism standpoint or an ecological standpoint, there's lots of different combinations of information. I used to always say to my students that as a grad student, I would just go home every day with these massive headaches because just the amount of information you were learning. You had to know the living plants, plus the ancient plants, plus the ecosystems, plus the everything. It was just—
Excuse me,
yeah.
James,
Yeah.
Did you run the PowerPoint?
Oh, is it not coming up?
Yeah, you already have the application, but not the whole, it's not running as a slideshow.
Okay, thanks guys. Hold on for a second. Let me see what's going on here.
You have to run the slideshow.
Slideshow on the top.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just I was doing it, but for some reason it wasn't doing it. Hold on for a second.
Okay.
Let's do that. And then can you see it now?
Okay,
Yep.
right.
There we go.
Can you go back to the first slide, or is this the first?
The first slide was just the title slide.
Okay, then this is
Right,
great, wonderful.
Thanks, guys, for giving me the heads up on that. Okay, so basically, when we're going to look at things from an ecological system standpoint, we're going to talk about ecosystems, and then we're going to talk about biomes as well. And you can imagine over geologic time, those ecosystems, those biomes have changed dramatically over time, compared to what the Earth was like 3 billion years ago. It is much, much different nowadays. And thankful for that, because most of us would not be able to survive what the Earth was like 3 billion years ago as a whole. So you might be asking yourself, well, what are we going to cover geologically? Because the Earth is pretty old, right? The Earth is about 4.5 billion years. So luckily we don't, if we're plant-minded people, if we're really just interested in plants, we don't need to go back that far to 4 billion years, but it's only about 500 million, only, I say here. So what we'll look at is we'll look at the time period that is most recent here that we would call the Cenozoic era, and we're currently in the Quaternary here, so roughly the last 3 million years, and we'll talk about that more towards the end of my presentation. We'll talk about a time that's known as the Mesozoic era, or some people refer to it as the age of dinosaurs. And so during this time, the Cretaceous, the Jurassic, the Triassic is a time in which a bunch of different ecosystems and biomes appear, and we'll talk about that as well. And then we'll even go back as far as over 500 million years ago to a time called the Paleozoic era. This is the area that I studied the most during my tenure in grad school. And it includes everything from the Permian to the Carboniferous Coal Age, the Devonian, the Silurian, the Ordovician, and the Cambrian, which if any of you Googled most of these things, you find lots and lots of cool pictures of what's happening in the ocean, but not as many people studying what's happening on life or with plants in particular. So there's even some really interesting ecosystems and biomes that pop up even this far back in time. So what I'm going to do for you guys, and I've always done this in my classes, I'm going to keep this little time bar up here, and you'll always see it being highlighted to give you an indicator of where we are when we're talking about it, because there's just no way you're going to be able to remember all that kind of stuff. So that'll be a reference for you guys on the very, very top. So the other thing I want to define here is, what do I mean by a biome here? Well, biomes are just large ecosystems, right? You probably all learned this back in middle school or high school, but they're large ecosystems that have very similar attributes about them, climate, things like that. And we tend to find them around the world. So for example, a desert is a biome, right? And we could find deserts in the southeast of the United States, as well as I could find deserts on the Arabian Peninsula. I could find deserts that were in Australia, right? Would I have the exact same species? Probably not, but I would have organisms, both flora and fauna, that would be adapted to the particular habitat that they're living in. And we would call those similar biomes, right? So there are these worldwide ecosystems. And how biomes tend to be defined is multivariate. So there's lots of different ways that people have tried to define biomes. One that I actually find to be very useful is by Robert Whitaker back in the mid to late 1900s. He created this graph that you see here called the Whitaker graph. And I know a bunch of you are like, wait a minute, it's a Saturday morning, Jamie, what are you doing giving us graphs? How dare you? But I promise you it's going to be a helpful little feature as we go along. So what Whitaker created here is he basically said that almost all biomes can be defined based upon their annual average temperature here, which you see on the x-axis, right? And their annual average precipitation, which could be snow or rain here. And if you knew those two things, annual average versions of them, you could pretty much figure out the biome that exists in that particular part of the world. Now, the flavors and the variations of that biome could change, right? But more or less, if you had a spot on the face of the earth that was very, very warm, which would be on this right-hand side, and very warm, right? And very, very wet, you almost definitely are going to get a tropical rainforest, right? At that same kind of thing, if you had an area that was very, very cold and very little precipitation in any form, you probably have a tundra. And we're going to talk about all these kind of things, but just realize that climate, precipitation, temperature play a very, very big role in defining what the earth is like there, as well as things like the soil, which we'll talk about, as well as the plants and the animals that are in there as well. But all of these are interacting with one another, the living and the non-living, in order for us to get a feeling for what the biome that is there. So if we want to talk about the earliest ecosystems, at least when it relates to plants, you have to realize that for billions of years, there really has been no visible life on Earth. I sometimes use the analogy of us inventing a time machine, and we go back in some kind of spaceship time machine and we're floating around the Earth. If you were floating around the Earth for the last 4 billion, 3 billion, 2 billion, even 1 billion years, you probably wouldn't see much happening, and the Earth would look a lot like sort of Mars with water. But it would be deceptive because there would have been a lot of life on Earth, but it would have been single-celled organisms, prokaryotes, that we collectively call bacteria or the archaebacteria, and they would have been abundant on the face of the Earth. Now, if you were to probably sit down and take a look, you would see that some of these bacteria have been sophisticated enough to start to create these little high rises that we call stromatolites. And these things were abundant throughout Earth. And they still do exist on the western edge of Australia. There's still some stromatolites that are with us. But basically, these are little high rises, I'd like to call them, of bacteria. And there's just a film of cyanobacteria doing photosynthesis on the tops of these. But the rest of it is all sort of sand and calcium carbonate that have been solidified by the bacteria over hundreds of thousands of years. They're really pretty amazing structures here. So bacteria obviously would be around, and they probably were the first ones to figure out how to come onto the land. The problem is that bacteria don't preserve very well. So sometimes it's a matter of, what is our evidence, right, in science? And a matter of, it could be older, but we don't really know because we don't really have any evidence for that kind of stuff. So you have to realize that for most of Earth, even if it was starting to become multicellular, most of that life is still in the oceans. It's in the water. And so there's a diversity of things like sponges and algae and, early invertebrates, and even at some point fishes evolving inside the water. But at the same time, if you were to go onto the land, there probably wouldn't be much happening. Maybe there'd be some slime like algae or bacteria out on the land, but for the most part, there probably isn't much because it's a very, very dry habitat that most life couldn't survive there. So Earth sort of gets started in the oceans, and that's going to be sort of the seed by which all of these other pieces are going to then move out onto the land. What's pretty amazing is that some of the earliest organisms we find coming onto the land are things that are symbiotic organisms that are like lichens. So these lichens wouldn't be your friendly little lichens that you see on rocks when you're hiking nowadays. It was sort of the days of fungi being humongous fungus here. And one of these that's absolutely amazing that we find in the fossil record is this group of organisms called Prototaxides. So taxus, right, is the genus for yews. These logs were so large that we thought at first that they were logs of yew bushes from a long, long time ago, and just the proto version of them. But now our understanding is much, much better with better fossils, that these were enormously tall fungus lichen kind of organisms that dotted the landscape. And, since that time, lichens have gotten much, much smaller and have found a different niche, but it was sort of a world of fungi and lichens and algae back in this day as a whole. What we eventually would have seen, and what's going to lead to our plants here, is that we would have seen marine algae, particularly the green algae, becoming very, very successful, evolving into freshwater, living in freshwater lakes, streams, rivers, eventually evolving and adapting to becoming drier habitats, and then moving slowly from drier habitats to sort of wet, sort of streamside, marsh-side kind of environments. And that's where land plants actually evolve. So the green algae, as much as we may hate them at times, especially Spirogyra, because it mucks up a lot of our ponds, it's sort of the great granddaddies of all our plants living today. And eventually we would start to see the very first bryophytes popping up on land. Somewhere around the late Ordovician, we start to see the very first non-vascular plants, things like mosses, liverworts, hornworts, all these. Any of you who are big fans of bryology just love seeing these kind of things when you're hiking around, right? So for the most part, we would find spores and things like that in the fossil record. But what was pretty amazing is in 2019 in Tennessee, there was a researcher who actually found some amazingly preserved little ecosystem. And it's probably one of the best preserved ecosystems that we have found that included fossilized members of the mosses, of the liverworts, and of the hornworts, as well as these little standing lichens like Prototaxides, and even some invertebrates that probably lived in the water and sometimes came onto land to eat little bits and pieces of stuff. So an early ecosystem already forming, really pretty amazing. The one thing that I find so fun about, scientists can actually have a very fun time, is that this moss right here called Dollyphyton. So the locality where they found it was very, very close to Dollywood. So out of respect for Dolly Parton, they actually named a fossil moss after her. It's called Dollyphyton. So notice that plants are evolving and they're starting off on the watery edges of freshwater here, right? Not marine environments. And even to this day, that's where plants tend to dominate, is in areas that are just land or in freshwater environments. Very few plants seem to be able to handle salt water. So freshwater marshes, if you really want to call them that, are probably our first real ecosystems on the face of the earth. We define a marsh as being an area, a wetland that has emergent herbaceous plants. Well, that's what these were. They wouldn't have had cattails and things like that, but they would have had some of the earliest vascular plants that we could find. So remember, bryophytes are non-vascular, right? They don't have xylem and phloem, but the very first vascular plants would have started to pop up, evolving from some of those groups of organisms. And one of the earliest vascular plants that we find is this group called the rhinophytes, which really were just a bunch of sticks that sort of creeped along the ground and then made some little upright sticks. And then they would have little spore cases at their tips. So very, very humble, simple start in many respects for land plants. But these things were only moss sized, but inside they were much more complex. So this is actually a fossil And they cut through it, and all these circular things you're seeing are the stems magnified, but that little dot that you're seeing in the middle is actually the xylem and phloem in the middle. So very, very small amount to start off with, but it's sort of the beginning stages of something much more grand. Because what quickly evolves is different groups start to evolve from the rhinophytes. So a group called the Zosterophils, which also were aquatic wetland habitat plants and starting to grow upright. And now they're starting to make lots of really cool spore cases, especially along the sides, and making little cones out of them. And these are actually reconstructions from a couple different museums and botanical gardens like Kew around the world here, trying to show what they look like. These Zosterophils are actually closely related to our modern club mosses, if you know what those are. But club mosses in the modern world, right, look like this, things like the shining club moss or these ground pines, princess pines, right? So these things are actually more closely related to these, and these would be the great granddads of the club mosses. And so the other group that would have popped up on the landscape then is a group called the trimerophytes. And so the trimerophytes here were probably much bigger, much more sophisticated, could branch in a lot different ways. Branching is a very, very big part for a lot of these plants because they're more or less just competing with themselves. There's no animals that are really munching on them. They don't really have to deal with anything else, but they're competing for light, and they're trying to get taller and taller. And the more that you can branch and grab light, the more sophisticated you can be. But realize that none of these plants at this point have leaves, and none of them have roots. Pretty much the basic body plan for all of these is little creeping rhizomes across the ground, and then upright parts. But how your upright parts looked was different depending on the group and how sophisticated you got. But the trimerophytes would basically be the great grandparents of all plants that you know living on the earth today, with exception of the club mosses and the bryophytes. So obviously a very, very successful group, and this is the great grandparents of all those as a whole. The environment all of them are living in, right, is once again still living very, very, very closely connected to water, whether it's lakes, ponds, streams. Plants have not evolved to be sophisticated to live away from water. And so marsh-like environments really are our first step here. But what happens is, in geologic terms, pretty quickly, is that plants continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and they start forming tree-sized members. So as these plants get bigger and almost tree-sized, or almost like herbs on steroids kind of version here, that is actually going to start to change the ecosystem. So we all know that the environment affects plants, right? But plants then after a while start to affect the environment. And so we start to see somewhere in the middle Devonian here that the environment starts to change, and plants are changing the soil, the climate, the weather patterns, these kind of things as a whole. We start to see the very first tree-like plants appearing on the face of the earth. And this is a group that's very near and dear to my heart because I actually studied them for my master's degree. And there's been a lot of recent evidence that's come out of this from upstate New York. But these are a group that best could be described as sort of being ancient ferns. But I think if you and I took our time machine back then, we wouldn't necessarily think of them as being ferns because they would have been so weird and wacky looking. So here's some reconstructions of what they look like. They didn't have any leaves whatsoever, and they didn't have any wood. So that's why I'm saying that they're tree-like, because technically to be a tree, right, you need to have wood and make a cambium and have increasing girth. So these things were sort of more built like a banana or maybe a palm or something like that. And here's sort of a little cartoon sketch of what the branches and the stems and the twigs would have looked like. But notice that there's really no leaves on this. It's just little tiny twigs that were green that did photosynthesis. And so this thing would have been making all these really sophisticated branching systems, but was probably pretty weak as a whole. But it was the biggest plant on the landscape and the Earth's first attempt at making big tree-like things. And we refer to these things as the Gilboa trees, because they were first discovered in the early 1900s in Gilboa, New York. And so if you actually wanted to learn more about these plants, it's not a very far drive to take a road trip up to Gilboa, New York by the Schoharie Reservoir here, where we find a lot of these fossils. They've actually recently even built the Gilboa Museum that talks a lot about the ancient environments. It would have been what New York State in the Catskills would have been like back 370 million years ago, is tropical waterfront marine property. And so a lot of these early tree-like things have basically been found in an environment. But I say that they were weakly constructed because all we really knew about these trees for a very long time is just these enormous stumps. Now remember, the plants just before this were only getting to about 2-3 feet tall, and all of a sudden this thing pops up in the fossil record. So plants really took off really, really quickly. And here's a researcher who studies this, Chris Berry, crouching next to one of these trunks just to show you how big they were. And then the tree probably went for another 30 feet above that. So really pretty amazing. But hurricane storms probably just snapped the tops off these very, very easily. And it was a really great fossil find recently by Chris and my advisor, Bill Stein, who found a brand new locality and found the whole, almost like God had ripped the plant up and laid it down and fossilized it for us perfectly. And it's really, we know a lot more about these weird Gilboa trees. So that's Earth's first attempt at being tree-like. The very first true tree, a tree that actually has wood, a cambium, would, you know, if you and I went up to it, we would basically give it a hug and realize it was a tree, would be Archaeopteris here. So Archaeopteris is this plant that would have been, from a distance, I sometimes see it reconstructed here as almost looking like a bald cypress or something, or some kind of conifer. As you would have gotten up closer, you notice that the foliage on this looks much more fern-like. And so Archaeopteris means ancient fern. And for years, we just thought it was a tree fern or something like that, until people realized that these fern fronds were connected to wood. And they actually reconstructed, they've given a whole name to this group unto themselves. They call this group the pro-gymnosperms because they probably were the ancestors to the gymnosperms. But what's weird about this group is that they didn't make seeds. These were still spore-bearing plants. So there's nothing like this on the face of the earth that still lives, of a plant that makes wood, having a trunk, a cambium, all that kind of stuff, but then having fern-like foliage with spores, right? That doesn't exist anymore. So it's a really sort of cool transitional group here that is also the great-grandparents to all the seed plants that are found on the face of the earth, and played a major, major role in the ecosystem on the face of the earth. As these plants evolved and became big, they really dominated huge swaths of the earth. And no matter where, if you have late Devonian fossil sediments in your country, you will find Archaeopteris. It was a very, very successful tree that spread throughout the world. And some people even think on the animal side that these trees would have lived in water and almost have like very buttressy root kind of structures, as you can sort of see how they're trying to show in some of these reconstructions here, that this plant may have actually been a very important spot for lots of early amphibians to hide in amongst them. And maybe early limbs and things like that weren't used by early amphibians to come out onto land, but to actually navigate amongst these roots because they were trying to hide from 9-foot, 10-foot long fish that were hunting them in the water column. So really amazing, amazing environments. But these are our very first forests, right? These forests of real trees, although doesn't look like the forest that we would have, but it would be considered a forest by modern measures as a whole. And as you can imagine, once trees got established and once forest gets established, well, here we go. So we go into the Coal Age, which is known as the Carboniferous, starting about 360 million years ago. And by this point, we're really starting to get the ecosystem changing, because as you're getting more and more trees, more and more evapotranspiration, more and more humidity going into the air, the earth is a very warm tropical place to start with, but now it's actually becoming a steamy, warm tropical place. And the earth is sort of, the whole thing is like a very swampy-like environment during most of the Coal Age here, which is really pretty amazing world as a whole. So a tropical rainforest, as I was mentioned before, would be in this little sliver here of our Whitaker graph. And basically, you know, a rainforest doesn't necessarily always have to be flooded, but many are at times of the year in the modern world. Well, it was just in these ancient environments, it's sort of like swamp and a wetland environment dominated by trees meets rainforest, an area that has really, really high rainfall, precipitation rates, very high humidity levels, all those kind of things. So we're in a sort of a swampy rainforest that are easily evolving by 360 million years ago. And the main dominant trees in this environment are these enormous club mosses that we call scale trees. So once again, our little club mosses are princess pines and all these kind of things. One of my favorite plants. I just love when I see them, and they're so little and cute. they were enormous. They were 150 to 200 feet tall during the coal age, and the dominant tree in these swampy-like environments back in the day. So just really pretty amazing. And most of the coal, so when we get coal from Pennsylvania, West Virginia, those kind of areas, those come from the Carboniferous coal swamps, and most of that coal is actually dead club mosses, dead scale trees is what it is as a whole. In the understory, we would start to see tree ferns starting to evolve. So notice ferns are starting to look more like the ferns we would think of. So tree ferns, but in the order Moradiales. So if you guys know ferns, most of the tree ferns, if you can picture a tree fern in your head, let's growing in New Zealand or so, or Australia, those kind of things, Colombia, those tree ferns are much more modern versions of tree ferns that probably evolved during the dinosaur age. These ancient tree ferns are more related to this group called the Moradiales, which is still around. Here's a picture of Moradia up in the corner here. They tend not to be big tree-like versions anymore. They sort of make a small stump with big fronds, but they're still around, but they're not a very common type of tree fern. But that's what it would have been dominant back in the understory of some of these environments back during the Carboniferous. And then horsetails, another plant that I absolutely love, right? Equisetum here, the little Equisetum arvense here popping up in the leaf litter here, would have been enormous tree-sized horsetails back in those days as well. This amphibian probably being like 3 feet long, so it gives you an idea of how big horsetails were. What's pretty cool about horsetails, right, is almost you always find modern horsetails found around wetlands, once again, rivers, bogs, streams, ponds, right? That's almost exactly how they've lived back 360 million years ago. And it has not changed. Horsetails have been like the dominant living in sandy, wet soil for 360 million years. They've just gotten smaller, is what they've done. And the last thing I'll say about the coal age is that it was a time in which all these trees are doing tons of photosynthesis. So oxygen levels were the highest they ever were on the face of the earth, somewhere in the range of like 33% compared to like the 21% that it is now, meaning that it was high enough that just a lightning strike would actually cause forest fires. So even if it's being swampy in a rainforest, a lightning strike could cause a forest fire that would jump from tree to tree. And we actually get our first evidence of forest fires during this time. Those high oxygen levels also meant that it was a time that at least I don't want to go back to, because it had millipedes that were 6 feet long and dragonflies that were the size of red-tailed hawks. So a really creepy world of enormous trees and enormous invertebrates, but not too many vertebrates as of right now. They're sort of still in the water and trying to get a foothold here. So what happens is that at the end of the Carboniferous, we get a period in which things start to go bad and the earth starts to cool and the CO2 levels are dropping because plants are so successful, and the earth actually goes into a global cooling instead of global warming. And with that, the earth starts to go into a drying period as well. And so as we leave the coal age and move into a time called the Permian, we start to see these prolonged drying periods. Now you can imagine a plant that is spore-bearing. Spore-bearing plants, as we all know, like moisture. They need moisture for reproduction, but they tend to be plants that like moisture. So as the earth starts to go through these prolonged drying periods, a lot of these spore-bearing plants can't handle it. They may be still found along streams and nooks and crannies wherever it is wet, but most of the earth is getting much drier than it was before. And early on, so this is still a picture of the Carboniferous down here, but in the understory were the earliest seed plants sort of living there, just waiting for their time. And so they probably lived in special little niches, but they evolved the seed. And we refer to these plants as seed ferns. They still look like a tree fern, but they would have had actually big avocado-sized seeds actually attached to them. And these are some of the very first gymnosperms we actually find on the face of the earth, that by the time the Permian comes along and things are really starting to dry out, you can imagine that the seed, the evolution of the seed, was really, really important and allowing plants, especially seed plants, to once again start to diversify and spread across the earth. So you notice that now vertebrates have moved onto the land, and ecosystems in the sense of our ecosystems, right? Invertebrates, vertebrates, plants, all that kind of stuff are actually starting to really form themselves. So the Permian is the first time that we start to see all those kind of interactions of a carnivore eating an herbivore eating plants. All that kind of food web stuff is the very first time. But obviously none of these animals look, well, they look familiar because we've all had toy sets in our life, but they don't look familiar enough to what's living today as a whole. And one of the plants that was well known from the Permian age and a fairly dominant plant during this time is a plant called Chordites. So Chordites is a plant that has these sort of linear-like leaves. They were broad and thin, and if you looked at them, they would have almost looked like long grass leaves with like these parallel veins in them, but it would have been a tree. And you can see lots of different reconstructions of them here. They would have been making forest, and they were so adaptable that they even started to live along swamp estuary environments. So they would have looked like mangroves. They may have actually formed the first kind of mangrove environments as well as living in upland environments and forest environments. Evolutionarily, this group is really fascinating because it probably it's this group that is closely related to conifers. There's lots of things about their anatomy and their reproduction that seems to indicate that they're probably more closely related to conifers and probably were the great grandparents to conifers. So notice conifers and sort of their ancestors already starting to dominate on the face of the earth around 300 million years ago. And what will happen is that from the Permian and into the dinosaur age, the Mesozoic age, you will see that not spore-bearing plants, but seed-bearing plants and all these really bizarre gymnosperms that we find in the fossil record are going to start to diversify and spread across the world and move and, possibly dominating areas that are slightly wet, mesic, that kind of stuff, but also moving into dry areas, moving into upland environments, moving into mountainous kind of environments. So once again, here comes our time ship back 300 million years ago, and we're floating around the earth would start to really look green, and you probably see trees or plants in almost every nook and cranny, except for the really, really driest parts of the earth. You probably would see trees even living in upland environments and in the hills, which was a real challenge for plants not too long ago. As plants diversify and we go into the dinosaur age, you can imagine the animals are figuring things out too. And they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And now you're not only seeing competition between plants and, a little bit of competition here with some herbivores eating you, but now you have 20, 30, 40, 50 ton organisms like dinosaurs that are marching around and whole herds of them moving through the landscape and munching on you. You can imagine the kind of selection pressures that creates on you as a group of plants. So there's a lot of people who have proposed that as the conifers evolved, which were the dominant foliage, especially during the dinosaur age, that a huge herd of sauropods, these long-necked dinosaurs moving through a landscape, would certainly be a massive selection pressures for conifers to not only grow quick, but to try to grow as tall as possible. And it's very possible that the reason that we have sequoias that are 400 feet tall and things like that might be the result of selection pressures for hundreds of millions of years ago of these really, really large dinosaurs feeding upon you, and you're trying to get as tall as you can. It's very similar to like an acacia tree in modern world, right? The taller the acacia gets, the further away it can get from the giraffe and reaching for the neck. So selection pressures there as a whole. So maybe notice that I've been sort of hinting at dry habitats here. And you sort of sit there and go, well, where's the desert biome in all this? We've got lots of evolution here of going from marshes to swamps, rainforest, into forest environments. But what about the desert here as a whole? Now realize an arid landscape has been around on the face of the earth, for billions of years. Once again, if we were to take a spaceship back to 3 billion years ago to Earth, the land would look pretty desert-like. It would look like a Mars-like landscape, or if you found any kind of life, it probably would be soil bacteria or something like that surviving in little nooks and crannies. So it's not so much when did deserts evolve, because they probably have always been with us if you define them as an area that has practically no precipitation. It's what do we have evidence for plants actually evolving on the landscape as a whole. So remember, a desert has a pretty broad definition here as a whole. All of us know that deserts occupy this lower portion of the graph, meaning that they get very little precipitation, something like less than 10 to 15 inches of rain a year. But notice the temperature range, right? You can have very hot deserts like the Sahara and things like that. You can have very cold deserts as well as things like Antarctica and that kind of stuff and everything in between. You can have deserts along the oceans, you know, there's lots and lots of different variations of being a desert, but they're all connected here by having very low precipitation and or very high evaporation rates as a whole. And you can start to see that actually in the soils as well. Paleosols is what we refer to these in the fossil record. So they're ancient soils and they can fossilize, and you can start to see the same kind of characteristics we see in desert soils today. We can see those in fossilized soils. So we know deserts were around for a very long time, but some of the earliest plants that we get evidence for, that we see evolving and adapting to desert-like environments are the cycads. So I don't know if you guys know cycads. They're not a native plant in New Jersey, right? But we do have one that's native down in Florida, and they're found throughout the tropics. So this is really only a tropical or at best subtropical group of plants. But these plants were the palms before palms ever existed, right? So I just absolutely love cycads. I find them absolutely fascinating. And they look very palm-like, right? Some of them can get fairly tall with these palm-like fronds. Some of them sort of stay very stubby with palm fronds, but they make these absolutely enormous cones. Some of these can produce cones up to something like 2 to 3 feet long. They make the largest cone of any plant on the face of the earth. That's really, really impressive. Things like cycas and those other ones. The common name for these sometimes are called sago palms, and you can certainly find them in nurseries and things like that. They make great house plants, as I've always said. But we find evidence of cycads seem to evolve from some of these seed ferns before, and really adapted pretty well to desert-like environments. And these may have been some of our very first desert plants. So cycads were the cacti before cacti ever evolved, and there are still to this day many cycads that are adapted to dry habitats, but cycads also diversified and can live in tropical rainforests and all that kind of stuff. They just can't handle the winter cold like we have here. Another group that I have to mention, just because it's so cool, such a cool example of convergent evolution here, is at the same time we find this group of plants that we call the cycadioids. So the cycadioids here are, for years, we thought these were just a different flavor of cycad, right? Look at them. They look just like a cycad. And you can imagine if we only have the fossil record and the trunks and the leaves of it, you would think it was a cycad too. But over the last couple decades, we've gotten better and better fossils and a better reconstruction of these things. So notice that this particular cycadioid has these weird looking flower-like things on it, right? And you might be sitting there going, wait, what's going on here? So now we actually understand that these plants looked like cycads, but were not related to cycads in any way, shape, or form. And this is an example of convergent evolution, that plants had figured out how to adapt to desert-like environments, just like the spurges and the cacti today, convergent evolution. Back during the dinosaur age, it would have been cycads and cycadioids both adapting to this brand new environment that they figured out how to live in, called the desert. But what was so cool about the cycadioids is they made cones. They were still cone-bearing plants. They're still gymnosperms, but they made these cones that then had petals around them. So it may have been one of the very first plants to actually start to use insects for insect pollination. Isn't that cool? So the thing I always like to tell my students is that flowering plants did invent flowers, but they didn't invent flowers first. They invented the fruit first, but they didn't invent flowers first. The cycadioids were actually one of the first groups to invent a flower, a frilly looking thing to attract insects, and probably were insect pollinated, just like cycads are actually insect pollinated as well. But these probably were the masters of doing it back in the day. Really weird group that went extinct at the end of the dinosaur age. And then here comes our conifers. So conifers were doing really, really well, but notice that where they figured their strategy out pretty early on was they could live in forests down at low latitudes, but they also could figure out moving into high latitudes, started to evolve all these adaptations for being in dry environments. And we really see conifers also moving into a lot of desert-like or sub-desert-like environments. And some of these Voltzialian conifers, they are conifers, but they're sort of like an ancient conifer is what they are. They look a lot like a lot of these like cuprous kind of things that we have on the landscape today, living almost look like an Araucaria, Norfolk Island pine, and that kind of stuff living on the landscape. But they were some of the earliest conifers living in these very, very dry environments. So you might sit there and say, Well, when's he going to mention cacti? Because deserts, once I think deserts, I think cacti. I realize that in the modern world, cacti make up less than 10% of plant species. I'll say it again, less than 10% of desert species are cacti. Isn't that pretty amazing? But when most of us think of a desert adaptation, right, we think of the Cactaceae, the cactus family here. So cacti have probably been around for the last 60 million years. You know, the saguaro cactus here living in the Sonoran Desert of the United States is really a magnificent plant here. But the best we, cacti and deserts don't preserve information very well. And the best information that we know is that they've probably been around for roughly the last 60 million years. So, not that long ago geologically, but, they did pop on the landscape after the dinosaurs ended as a whole. And one of the big mysteries is always like, well, where did cacti come from? They're such a very stereotyped look, they look so much different than other plants, that we sort of understand that cacti probably evolved from a plant that looked very, very similar to this ancient, still living cactus that we call Pereschia here. So notice Pereschia, if you look here, right, it looks a lot like a cactus, has those little areoles with the spines, but they still make these very leathery, broad leaves to them, and they're shrubby here living in the landscape. So Pereschia is not a super successful shrub, but it's still around and it's in the cactus family. But we think something like this was actually the very first cactus-like thing, and then became more and more like the cactus we know and love as they lost those broad leaves and became more succulent and things like that. So the other forest that we haven't talked about here, right, is deciduous forests. So how would we figure out a deciduous forest as a whole? Well, you got to find some way of finding deciduousness in the fossil record. And sometimes if the leaves are preserved well enough, you can actually tell that the leaves had a little abscission zone, or, on the twigs, it looks like it created a little wound tissue for the abscission zone. So there are some ways that you can start to tell that this plant probably shed its leaves. And when it was shedding its leaves, it actually created a little wound tissue in between the petiole of the leaf and the twig. And the leaf didn't fall off, right? It gets pushed off is really what happens here. So there is evidence for deciduousness, but as a whole, good fossils sometimes are hard to find. But one of the earliest examples that we find that probably was a deciduous plant is, once again, back to the Permian, this plant called Glossopteris. Now, the phrase Glossopteris means tongue fern is what it means. And as you look at these leaves, right, they look like big tongues is what they were. So that's why it got that name. It certainly doesn't look like a fern, right? They just sort of look like very tropical magnolia leaves or something like that. But this plant during the Permian was a very, very successful plant. It was a plant that dominated mostly the southern hemisphere, what we would have called Gondwana, so areas of like Antarctica, Australia, southern South America, but would have just been very, very successful and prolific throughout it. The one thing that's very interesting, especially for people who study paleobotany in Antarctica, so these are people going to Antarctica, which used to be tropical and warm at one point, millions of years ago, and they find these beautiful tropical, here you are in negative 40-degree wind chills, and you're finding these beautiful tropical leaves sitting there in the rocks because Antarctica was in a much, much different place. But the thing is, you find a lot of them. You find the leaves very similar to almost like right now at this time of year, if you were to walk through our forests, right, you'd find an awful lot of leaves on the ground because our trees are deciduous. Well, basically, when you start to see this many leaves, they're laying in the fossil record, and overabundance compared to how most leaves preserve, it starts to hint that this tree was also deciduous. And good fossils do tell us that this thing actually produced abscission zones and snapped the leaves off and all this kind of stuff. So this really weird broadleaf gymnosperm that it's not really related to conifers at all. It was sort of in its own little group here as a whole, being very, very successful and living in these early southern hemisphere environments, probably being one of our first deciduous plants and making our first deciduous forests. The leaves are so prolific around the world during the Permian that they were used by Alfred Wegener, that's who this striking dude is right here. Alfred Wegener is well known for being the first person to come up with the idea of plate tectonics and continental drift here. So he actually used the leaves where you see dark green here is all the places that you find the same species of Glossopteris throughout the world, right? South America, India, Africa, parts of India, Australia, Antarctica, they're all the same species. And those continents are obviously much, much further apart as a whole. And Alfred Wegener, with also using rock data and a bunch of other pieces of data, as well as the leaves, was able to piece this together and say, I think the continents at one point were actually all together and they've separated to be where they are now. They actually moved. Obviously, he was laughed off the stage early in his days, but it's amazing how we definitely know that this is how it happened nowadays, but back in his day, people thought he was absolutely crazy. But Glossopteris plays a big role in our understanding of plate tectonics. And then ginkgo, how could we not talk about ginkgo, the living fossil? So good old ginkgo, the maidenhair tree here, a plant that probably pops up, somewhere at the beginning of the dinosaur age, maybe a little bit before that, not really looking like ginkgo back then, but by the time we're in the middle of the Jurassic, good old dinosaur age time, ginkgo would have looked a lot like a ginkgo. Here's a little reconstruction with some early dinosaurs and birds in the Jurassic, and there's a ginkgo tree that this organism is actually nesting underneath it. So ginkgos were pretty successful. The thing I like to say about ginkgos too is that flowering plants at this point had not evolved. And it was almost like ginkgo was a little bit of a hybrid between a conifer and an angiosperm. They have like a metabolism, the deciduousness, all this kind of stuff of being, and also those pulpy, stinky seeds that we all hate, being almost very angiosperm-like, being like a flowering plant before flowering plants appeared. But at the same time, they sort of can look like a conifer and act like a conifer with their growth habit and that kind of stuff too. But it's just probably one of the very first plants during the dinosaur age to be deciduous and also have leaf color change as well, as we see that beautiful yellow color as a whole. It's just that one species, good old Ginkgo biloba, has survived to this day. But there were, thousands of, well, probably not thousands, but hundreds of species of ginkgo back during the Jurassic. It was their heyday, was the Jurassic period. And poor ginkgo has only been winnowed down to one, those good old Ginkgo biloba. So somewhere around 50 million years ago, things start to get much, much colder here. There's lots of reasons for that we could talk about later. But basically, the Earth is sort of a very warm, steamy land through the dinosaur age. Here's where basically dinosaurs go extinct, right at this line here. And as we go into the age of mammals, the Earth is still pretty warm up to about 50 million years. And notice that our general slide to the modern day has just been this long-term cooling trend. And what that long-term cooling trend means also that not only did the Earth cool, but it actually became starting to be drier in particular areas. But it also means that where most of the Earth would have felt very tropical, even things like areas of the upper temperate zone up to like Alaska would have actually been felt subtropical. And you would have had palms and cycads even living up in areas where like Alaska would be in the Arctic Circle. Now the Earth is actually becoming more and more modern. The temperate zone would start to look like the temperate zone that we know. And what we would know as the temperate deciduous forest would have started to form probably within the last 30 million years. So we would have had deciduous plants earlier, but the temperate deciduous forest, like in the middle of our Whitaker graph here, what we know and love in our tri-state area and all along the eastern seaboard here with that leaf color change is probably something that has been around for about the last 30 million years. So now we're going to start jumping to much more closer to the modern day here. The grassland biome is an absolutely fascinating biome and one that I love because I'm infatuated with grasses as a whole. Grassland, right, is this sort of dry ecosystem with a rich mix of forbs, right? Grasses as well as non-grasses that we call forbs here. Notice where grasslands exist in the Whitaker graph, right? There can be a big range of temperatures here, but it doesn't get a lot of rainfall. And when grasslands get destroyed, especially by agriculture, right, they become desert-like environments. We refer to this as desertification. So the two tend to find themselves very, very close to one another. But at the same time, a grassland is a very, very productive environment, right? It's these grasses which hold the soil, some legumes mixed in with it, some things in the daisy family mixed in there, right? But more or less grasses are dominating these environments. And then you can imagine you can't get a grassland unless you have grasses evolving, right? So flowering plants evolve at the very end of the dinosaur age, somewhere around 130 million years ago. And it looks like grasses pop up at some point shortly after that. So if the very first flowering plants we know are about 130 million years ago, about 100 million years ago, we start to find some really cool fossils of grasses. This is amber that encased a floret of a grass. And it's about 100 million years ago. What's cool about this fossil is it actually has ergot, the fungus ergot that infects a lot of grasses, especially grains, was already found on this little floret. So that parasitism was happening even 100 million years ago. We also find in coprolites from dinosaurs, we find these things called phytoliths, these like silica-like stones that grasses will make and put inside their cells. And they tend to be indicators of grasses or even get you down to genus species level. But that was found actually in the coprolites, inside the feces, the fossilized feces of dinosaurs. So we know that grasses were around and dinosaurs were even starting to eat them. But what's interesting is that early grasses, or the larger order, the poales, not the poaceae, but the poales were actually wetland plants. So it seems like grasses first evolved. This group evolved to actually be wetland plants living on the edges and making these marsh-like systems, right? So here's our true marshes that we can think of in the modern sense were probably popping up around that particular time in the late Cretaceous period. But grasses, in the sense of like the grassland, they start to pop up more around 30 to 25 million years ago. So dry adapted grasses that have C4 photosynthesis, all this other kind of stuff that people talk about, they started to become more widespread. The reason that they start to become more widespread is the earth is starting to get drier and drier and drier and cooler. And grasses were one of the plants that figured out how to dominate in this environment. They do very, very well in these cold, dry, or at least some do really well in these cold, dry, adapted environments. And they really pretty much spread across the globe, taking over the niches where the trees start to dwindle because they weren't getting enough rain, and those forests start to disappear. Grasslands moved into these environments. So it's pretty interesting. Somewhere around 25 to 30 million years ago, we see the earth starting to change and become much more grassland dominated as a whole. Now, these aren't the grasses I think that Caitlin's going to talk about, right? The lawn is just a whole different issue, but grass as a group, as an evolved group, is just really pretty amazing, and the effects that it actually had. So it obviously makes the grassland biome, right? But it really even starts to affect the evolution of animals on the face of the earth. So before this time, we might have had herds of dinosaurs coming through and eating conifers, but this idea of like the prairies with massive herds of bison is really a result of grass and animals evolving to learn to feed on these grasses. Or even think of like the Serengeti today, these savanna grassland kind of environments, like one of the few environments that still looks very ancestral, of zebra and wildebeest and all of these gazelles feeding in absolutely enormous herds. The animals evolved and adapted very quickly to figuring out how to eat these grasses, even though the grasses are very hard on their teeth and feeding upon it. And really, that's what North America would have looked like 10 million years ago, would have been massive herds of even horses and camels and all this kind of stuff. And they've either gone extinct or we sent them to extinction. And it's really, just a few species like the bison, which is coming back, that are our herds on our prairies as a whole. Okay, so we get to the end here. Let's talk a little bit about this different kind of environment that we would call the pine barrens, right? That you guys know all too well. Now, if we're going to get this close to modern world, it's going to be hard for us to keep this chart up here. So I'm going to expand this out. And we're just going to keep the Cenozoic here for the most part here, with the Paleogene, the Neogene, and the Quaternary here. So the eastern Atlantic coastline would have been something that has been forming for a long period of time. But as the Earth is getting cooler and cooler and cooler, as it's going into all these glaciation events, sea levels would have started to go down, right? As water gets trapped up in glaciers, sea levels start to go down. And so that eastern seaboard would have been started to be exposed. But then you have lots of glaciations coming in, lots of different things. So the pine barrens, as we sort of know it, probably formed somewhere during the Pleistocene, somewhere between 2 million years ago, and maybe up to the last ice age, 12,000 years ago as a whole, with that really all those amazing little microenvironments. So these multiple cycles of glaciation would have basically been scouring the underlying bedrock. And in that process, it's depositing sand and debris as it's going along. Now, where the pine barrens are located in Long Island and all this other kind of stuff is sort of at the terminal edge of where the glaciers reached to the southern tip of the glaciers here. So you would have seen at some point sort of like stagnant melting ice and all this kind of debris here outwash. And then at some point, those glaciers would have retreated, right? Here's a glacier up in Norway, and you would have seen this, what's called terminal moraine is what they refer to it as. So lots of this till and sand and rock and all that kind of stuff being left behind. And that plays a really big part in the creation of that sandy kind of infertile soil that we find in the pine barrens and in other words. So it's not that plants just evolved this kind of stuff. There were plants that probably had evolved to nutrient poor acidic soils, but in a relatively short period of time of only a couple million years, there were particular plants like in the Ericaceae and pines obviously do very well in these acidic and fertile zones. And sphagnum is one of these plants that we find, back in the Ordovician. So sphagnum is a very, very ancient species of moss. It seems like it's always been living in these kind of environments and even creating some of these kind of acidic-like, maybe boggy-like environments. But these guys are probably more recent. Maybe pine's not as recent, but then the Ericaceae more recently. Something like the Atlantic white cedars, right, which are so indicative of some of these areas, were probably surviving and obviously moving south as the glaciers were proceeding as a whole. As those glaciers retreated, those Atlantic white cedars probably moved back into their environment. So an environment that would have had very low sea levels and all these little river trenches, that eventually, as the glaciers retreat and leave all this sill and sand and gravel, it would sort of look like an environment like this. And then eventually you're going to get an environment with like back swamps and flood basins and all that kind of stuff. And this is very similar to the kind of environment that those Atlantic white cedars now live in, creating like those little micro environments, right, where they can survive. What's interesting is the Chamaecyparis, that genus, was actually found in Europe, North America, lots of different spots, and probably has been around all the way back to the dinosaur age, but it obviously went extinct over in Europe and is really just found on the West Coast and East Coast. There are different species here. And that's sort of where it's surviving, very similar to like what sequoia is surviving just on the West Coast here. And what's cool here is, at least when I'm hiking around the pine barrens, you come across some of these bogs with carnivorous plants. So obviously, once again, sphagnum playing a big part in some of these areas. But then looking at carnivorous plants, right, they seem so stereotyped, such an amazing adaptation here. The pitcher plants like Sarracenia and the sundews here like Drosera, it always makes you scratch your head like, where did those come from? That's absolutely amazing that it evolved. Well, the best evidence that we have is that back, somewhere around maybe 40 million years ago, we find some fossils. One of the best fossils in amber, once again, is this leaf stalk that distinctly looks like it's got a bunch of little sticky traps all attached to it. And people have really examined this over and over again, even done all these very fascinating statistical and mathematical studies on this, to the point where they actually say that it is probably just a different species of the living Rorigula, which grows and survives in South Africa today. So it's this really weird, almost slightly shrubby, pseudo-carnivorous plant that grows there. So we all know the sundew, right? The sundew actually makes sticky traps, it makes enzymes, it catches the insects, it absorbs the stuff. There's a bunch of different steps in order to be considered truly carnivorous. Rorigula is considered proto-carnivorous because it actually has the sticky traps. It sticks the bugs so they can't go anywhere, but it actually cannot absorb the bugs. It has not evolved that feature. And so you might sit there and go, well, how does it get nourishment? Well, there's this tiny little bug that crawls around, and sometimes you can see some of these little black dots are actually not things that are stuck to it, but it's this bug that it lives in association and mutualism with them. Those bugs come along, eat the thing that was stuck, and then those little bugs poop. And as the poop goes down, that actually nourishes the soil, and the Rorigula actually survives off that. So they haven't quite achieved true carnivory, but we think that given the early fossil date of this and a lot more of what we know about carnivorous plants, that there probably were different stages of carnivory here. And something like this back 40 million years ago show that, you know, it took a while for plants to figure this out, but it's been around for a fair amount of time for being as specialized as it is. All right, so as we come into sort of our last couple biomes here, we're really getting close to modern age, close in geological terms to Jamie Boyer here, okay? So the boreal forest, sometimes referred to as the taiga, in Russian, taiga means, you know, coniferous forest, would have probably formed within just the last 12,000 years, which is pretty amazing, right? So the taiga is this area that, you know, it gets sort of low to moderate precipitation depending on where you are in the taiga, but they are distinctly cold environments here. They have a very brief growing season. They tend to be these snowy, cold forests that are dominated mostly, right, by conifers, very cold adapted conifers living. And if you look on this map, right, it's sort of a good chunk of Canada and Siberia and, you know, area. In today's world, the taiga is the largest biome on the face of the earth. And for that reason, conifers, like if you were to take any of the groups, whether you look at mosses, ferns, conifers, flowering plants, conifers probably make up more biomass on the face of the earth than any other group of plants. It's because the taiga as a biome is the largest on the face of the earth, and the conifers dominate in this particular biome. But, you know, if any of you have ever visited the taiga and took a train across it or drove through it, it's not a very fun plant ID thing, because it's like you're IDing just a handful of conifers and then you get bored pretty quickly because it's the diversity is pretty low. So it's a few species that have figured this out and really dominate across the landscape for the most part. You know, there's a mixture of things like mosses and some lichens in this environment, you know, and a couple deciduous angiosperms that are more like shade intolerant forest edge kind of plants like poplars and things like that. But it almost feels, at least to me it does, doesn't this feel like it's almost should have been an ancient environment? Conifers, lichens, mosses, it feels like it should have been made so long ago, but it just shows you how Mother Nature can sort of reinvent things as a whole as plants adapt to whatever the new environment is. So as those glaciations have basically retreated here and left us in this interglacial period that we are since the last glaciation 12,000 years ago, basically the taiga has come in to sort of fill this whole northern hemisphere area. And another one that sort of goes pair and sister with this is right above that, it's the tundra. And the tundra here is, you know, our coldest of all the biomes and even less precipitation. A lot of that snow and ice is actually trapped up for thousands and thousands of years and not really that much snowing happening here. So the tundra is different than the taiga in the sense that there really are no trees here for the most part. It's considered just to be a treeless plain, as the name indicates, with very short, you know, couple month growing season at best. And once again, this is an environment that is dominated by mosses and lichens, and it even has some angiosperms that are ground hugging, right? There's a willow that lives in the tundra, but it basically just grows along the ground and doesn't get tall at all. It's really, really bizarre looking species of salix there. So once again, another environment that seems like it should be super ancient, but it's actually quite modern just after the last glaciations. So you might sit there and go like, well, why, well, where did it come from? Why is it so recent as a whole? And part of the answer that we're going to end with here is that the tundra and the taiga basically over the last, you know, roughly 100,000 years here have replaced a biome that doesn't exist on the face of the earth anymore. So there used to be a biome, a good chunk of North America and Europe and parts of Russia, would have been this biome called the Mammoth Steppe. And so any of you guys remember what a steppe is? It's like a short leaf grassland here, short grasses here living here. But it was this extinct biome, or mostly extinct biome, that was very cold. It was dry, as you would expect, but it was a very productive biome. So unlike the tundra, right, which is sort of a biome that does not change very much at all. And when people come in and even drive trucks through it and things like that, you can see these tire tracks for, hundreds of years kind of thing. Probably in the future, those tire tracks will still be there because it doesn't change very much. The Mammoth Steppe actually was a little bit different with these very productive grasses growing in these kind of environments. So you might not be able to notice from this picture here, but you can sort of tell that it's grass there. So lots of very highly active grasses mixed in with a few herbs, some willow shrubs mixed into this environment. And there are little bits and pieces of the Mammoth Steppe still with us in the northeast of Siberia. But where did they go? So this biome was with us for a good chunk of the Pleistocene period here. It was basically around for at least 100,000 years from what we know. And during the Pleistocene period, it would have been the most extensive biome on the face of the earth. So it doesn't mean that the rainforest disappeared or desert, right? It just means that all those bits and pieces were just much smaller on the face of the earth. But if you looked at the earth, let's say 200,000 years ago, it would have really looked like it was mostly Mammoth Steppe throughout the world, and then little bits and pieces of other things around as a whole. So as the Mammoth Steppe disappeared, what has come in to replace it then are these relatively recent biomes called the tundra and the taiga, which is really pretty amazing. And so the reason it probably has disappeared is that the tundra steppe, or the Mammoth Steppe, was actually dominated by these very large herbivorous and carnivorous animals, such as the mammoths, right? As where it gets its name. So mammoths, very large herbivorous animals, horses, camels, bison, as well as we would have the American lion and all these other kind of carnivores, wolves, all these kind of things feeding upon those. So it was an amazingly productive ecosystem, even though it was cold and dry in this environment. And as most of those herbivores disappeared, whether the mammoths were killed off by us or whatever, as those things disappeared, so did the Mammoth Steppe and became tundra and taiga. So the last piece I'll leave you with here is that there is somebody who is trying to bring it back. And so there's a little spot in northeast Siberia here by a father and son team of researchers, and they call this area Pleistocene Park. And they've actually already reintroduced American bison and some ancient horses and yaks and caribou, really the things that are still living that they can reintroduce to try to bring back the Mammoth Steppe. Because the thinking here, right, is that the Mammoth Steppe is an environment that was created and controlled by the large herbivores. And once those disappeared, the Mammoth Steppe disappeared. So if we bring those back, that we actually will get the Mammoth Steppe to come back. So there are little bits and pieces of the Mammoth Steppe still found in Siberia. So they've taken those pieces and now are introducing these large herbivores to try to bring back. And some of you may have actually read in the newspaper or on the news, heard about somebody trying to bring back the mammoth. And if they bring back the mammoth, they're going to reintroduce them into Pleistocene Park. So it's obviously a huge ecological ethical considerations into all this stuff, but it's these same people that actually want to bring back the mammoth and introduce them. And the reason that they're basically doing it is they're trying to control climate change. So the thinking here is that the Mammoth Steppe, this highly productive grassland, was able to be productive because of these large herbivores. And as these herbivores would move and eat, they would move the snow, right? And basically that environment is much more exposed to cold winds, and therefore the ground stays frozen. So there's a huge concern for us nowadays that the tundra, in that area with all of its frozen carbon and methane in those soils, as global warming warms it, that's going to be released, and our problems with global warming are only going to become much, much worse as all that tundra and old mammoth steppe starts to thaw out. So people are very, very concerned about this, and possibly by introducing back in these organisms, we can reduce that by making it back into the mammoth steppe and trapping and keeping that ground cold as a whole. It's obviously a hypothesis, right? And lots of people are very skeptical about this, but it's a very interesting, from a paleobotanist standpoint, it's a very, very interesting thing to see. And the last thing I would just say is that realize, we talked a lot today about the evolution of all these different biomes in ecosystems, right? So lots of new things popping up, but realize there are some biomes that have also disappeared, like the mammoth steppe. And one of the things that changed that is because species disappeared, right? So certain species disappear, and as some species disappear, maybe an ecosystem changes, but if enough species disappear, whole biomes may change. And obviously, as we are concerned and think more and more about the changes we're making to the earth, there are people who are very concerned about the changes we may be making are obviously affecting species, and things are going extinct, but we may be affecting enough species that we might actually see whole ecosystems, whole biomes start to collapse and disappear. And the people who like to quibble and make fun little jokes of like, oh, it doesn't make a difference if this one orchid disappeared, kind of thing. But when we're looking at the whole ecological package and ecosystems turn into biomes here, these things need to be considered, and global climate change and the effects that we're having on the earth can not only affect just species like an orchid, but can affect whole ecosystems and whole biomes. And it's something that we should be, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir with most of you guys, we should be very concerned about. But from an ecological standpoint, right, we've even seen evidence that the mammoth steppe is our 12,000-year-old evidence of what happens when we overhunt a bunch of mammals, and the changes that can even just happen within a short period of time, and maybe they're even happening even quicker. So not to start end on a depressing note, but it is sobering news. And sometimes when you study the geologic history of the earth, it can be very informative, right? So that we understand what's going on for us, but it also can be very sobering information. And so hopefully this has informed all of you. You've learned a little bit more about how our ecosystems and our biomes have changed and evolved throughout the earth. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jamie, for a really interesting program. And I learned a lot, even though I've gone over the evolution of all these plants and at Brown University. So they all sound familiar, vaguely familiar. We have some questions for you in our question and answer section. One person said, would we be able to have a slime mold program sometime? I'd be interested in that.
Yeah, I was going to say maybe Heward and I should chat about it. That'd be a fun little collaboration. Well, let us think about it. I mean, I grow for our plant diversity course at the garden. I actually grow a slime mold so everybody can see them and experience them. Now, obviously, some people see them when they hike, but we actually grow some so people can see them. The fun thing that I always do with the slime mold that we have is because they do move in fairly real time, but in lab you might not see them, right? So we usually do a time lapse and snap pictures of it. It's really cool to see that over a couple of hours it moving around.
Yeah, it's about a centimeter per hour or so.
Yeah, pretty cool.
A little slow. Yeah, we have. I have a fairly good sized collection of the sporangia, preserved sporangia, and have information on the genetics and physiology and ultrastructure. So I think it would be a great program.
Yeah, let us chew on it.
We can get together on it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. How tall did the lichen tree grow?
Prototaxites. So what's interesting is the very first prototaxis we find aren't probably any bigger than a pencil. So they start off pretty small. Okay. And then by the time we get into the Devonian, they were probably 25-foot tall logs. Really pretty amazing. Would have towered over anything else that was on the landscape. Just immense.
That's pretty good for a lichen.
Yeah, exactly.
Rather surprising.
Yeah. Be cool to still see them, wouldn't it? Wouldn't it be cool to be hiking in the woods or up in a mountain crevasse and see a huge lichen 25 feet tall?
Well, we have a question on what was the climate like when the first tree emerged? I guess depends on what your definition of the tree is. I suppose maybe a real tree with
So
Canada and
during
everything.
the middle and late Devonian, the earth is very warm, higher CO2 levels, very steamy, and where we find the fossils are equatorial, subtropical, equatorial, tropical kind of environment. So it would have been probably pretty warm and steamy, very similar to probably warmer than the tropics today, but not too much warmer than the tropics today. But that kind of steamy, warm environment would have not been cool at all. And in fact, there's debate whether the earth was so warm, there probably wasn't polar ice caps at that point. So just as a whole, earth very, very warm.
Okay, another question. How did the ancient ferns get to be very tall without any wood?
Oh, that's a great question. So this is one of these beautiful examples of, plants can figure out a way to do things without the traditional methods, right? So your traditional tree would use wood and a cambium and all that kind of stuff, and that tends to be the general strategy. What a palm or a tree fern would use, or even bananas, those kind of things. These plants, they basically use lots of fibers is what they do. So it's a tissue type called sclerenchyma is what they refer to, but fibers is how we would all know them. But they're almost like these reinforcing rods that are all throughout the plant. So as the plant grows, it's making these reinforcing rods. Bamboo does this as well. Bamboo has no wood in it, right? And those reinforcing rods make it super, super tough. But notice also, right, if I look at bamboo, it's the same width pretty much from bottom to top. So they don't have a way to increase girth. So a lot of these plants will have a maximum height that they can get to, or they'll make these upright portions, only short-lived. Like bamboo will have these upright portions that'll live for several years, but they won't get any taller. So it's a very cool way around the strategy for monocots, tree ferns. Also, tree ferns make lots and lots of roots that they use as guy wires to hold them up. So they basically have this trunk inside of it with all these little fibers that are keeping them strong, and then lots of guy wire roots coming out that basically hold them to the ground. Really amazing strategy around it.
Okay, we have a question on the ancestors of the angiosperms, I guess.
Yeah, notice I sort of skirted that one, didn't I? So there's lots of mystery still about where exactly the angiosperms come from. The problem is that there are lots of possible contenders of gymnosperms that they could be. More or less none of them that I had mentioned, because they tend to be more evolutionary oddities and didn't really play huge roles in ecosystems. But the one that I did mention is Glossopteris seems to be more closely related to angiosperms than it actually was to the modern gymnosperms today. But there is a group in the fossil record, and up on my website here, you can find about it, a group called the Caytoniales. Caytoniales is thought to be this weird gymnosperm group that is possibly either the closest sister group or possibly the ancestor to the flowering group, but there's obviously lots of debate about that.
Okay. Someone would like to know about the importance of mycorrhizae and when they appeared in the fossil record.
Yes. So my love of fungus here. What's really pretty amazing, right? You really have to give credit to the fungi here. So notice Prototaxites, right, is coming out of the land, and fungi and bacteria may have really been the first colonizers of the land. The other thing that's really cool here is that, remember I was talking about the rhiniophytes, the zostrophils, and the trimerophytes, those early marsh-like environments. As early as we have fossils that can preserve it. So there's this amazing fossil locality in Aberdeen, Scotland called the Rhynie Chert. That's where the rhiniophytes get their name. And it's super, super well preserved, and you can see the inner details of these plants. We find mycorrhizae all the way back then. So the earliest fossils that we have that could tell me if there's mycorrhizae. And there's lots of people, remember I mentioned these things don't have any roots. So there's lots of people who think that plants, can evolve and get drought adaptations, but the real thing that allowed them to venture out onto the land were the fungi. The fungi were the roots of the plants, and mycorrhizae and that symbiosis was really the reason that plants were able to move out onto the land, and those fungal hyphae actually became the very first root-like structures for plants to absorb nutrients and water from the substrate. And then only after that did plants evolve a true rooting structure, because they started to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and they needed a more sophisticated highway. As many of you may know from under microscopes, right? Fungal hyphae tend to be very, very small. They're almost like they're like the side roads, but the plants then finally needed like a highway system to move water. So they would have still had the mycorrhizae, and then the roots would have tapped in with that, and then on you go. But really, fungi are absolutely crucial to the evolution of plants onto the land.
Oh, how about, do you have a few words on the importance of mycorrhizae, I guess, in the forest today?
Well, it's amazing how much information is coming out with tree communication underneath the ground. It plays a tremendously important role. To some degree, it's the fact that we haven't looked at it decades ago, or only some people were looking at it. And nowadays, it's absolutely clear that fungi are connecting up all these plants of the same species, younger and older individuals, plants of different species, communication between these. It's absolutely amazing. And they're playing a huge role in not only the health, but they're also playing a role in actually shuttling nutrients from trees that may be older and not doing well. There's nutrients being shuttled over to them. Now, the larger evolutionary reasoning for this, sometimes you'll hear it and sometimes construed and anthropomorphic and all this other kind of stuff, but absolutely fungi are crucial to almost any ecosystem, if you think about it, but absolutely in forest ecosystems, connecting up not only trees of similar species, but even trees of different phyla, right? Conifers being connected up with angiosperms. I mean, at least lots of things blow Jamie Boyer's mind, but that blows my mind. Just the fact that they're connecting different phyla, really pretty amazing.
Okay, someone asked, are any of the slime molds edible?
Oh, Hubert, maybe you know that better than I do.
I have heard that you can eat some of them, some of the fruiting bodies. They're not poisonous, but the plasmodia could also be possibly eaten, but it smells terrible. If you see a big plasmodium, I guess some of the ones grow, I've seen them up to about 25 feet in diameter. That's my largest plasmodium. And I've seen several about 5 or 10 feet in diameter. Well, they stink. They are really quite odoriferous, and I would presume that's a method to keep people from eating them. So they do have protection. So I don't know if I'd want to eat a slime mold, especially the plasmodium. I guess the fruiting bodies are fairly nutritious, except they have a lot of chitin and cellulose. So I don't know how much you would get nutrition you get out of them. Oh, another question. With the climate change, should we be adapting as gardeners to try to grow some things more from the south?
Well, it's a good question. Now, obviously, some people who live in more extreme environments, like desert-like environments, you're seeing that, it's like where maybe if you lived in Arizona, you could grow a lawn at one point, but now it's getting to a point where you don't really almost even have a choice. And you need to put succulents as your front lawn. The reality is that things, even if, we mitigate this, that, and the other thing, is things are probably going to get warmer. Now, if we had enough time, right, plants would adapt and they would move over the thousands of years to actually adapt to the changes in warming. What's unfortunate is if the plants are so endemic to an area and that area then doesn't exist any further north, what happens a lot of times is they either have to quickly adapt, change, or they go extinct. So the reality for you as a home gardener, it's a hard question to answer, but the reality is you're probably going to find that the plants that live in your garden probably will have a longer, warmer growing season than what they did 10, 20, 30 years ago. They may also get more rainy or less rainy. So it's a little bit hard. The patterns of weather and climate are chaotic. So it's even hard to know, right? We just all assume it's going to get warmer and get drier, but that isn't always the case. And it might actually get warmer and wetter. in some areas of the world. So it's hard to know, like, oh, I'm going to start planting this southern plant, but it might actually be more drought adapted than what, so it's a little bit hard to necessarily know, but I'm sure that in a couple decades, what gardening looks like in New Jersey, southern New Jersey, is going to look different then than it does now. That's almost definitely the case.
Yeah, I've heard that maybe we should slow down on planting sugar maple or
Right.
something in New Jersey, because that might be a little bit too warm for it.
Right. Where sugar maples seem to already be marching more north and more productive up in Canada than they are here.
Well, here's a interesting question. Do we know the impact of worms on the mycorrhizal community?
It's a good question. I don't think I do. I don't know that interaction between the two. And obviously, there could be native worms, but then most of the worms we tend to talk about, right, are invasive worms that are found in a lot of ecosystems. I don't think I've ever read anything, nor could I speak about that. I don't know enough about it. It's a fascinating question, but I don't think I know the answer to it, unfortunately.
We did have some
Maybe Joan does
on programs for worms, jumping worms, and that kind of thing. Maybe native worms versus the invasive worms. Well, I don't know if we have any more questions. I think it was a really fascinating talk, and the listeners have been responding very nicely. So we really thank you, James, for your presentation, and a little different from what I've heard before about on plants, and a little different from what we usually have. So we appreciate having you on. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, so I guess I'll start the business meeting about now. We're 2 minutes early, but this is live, and we can't exactly